The first horse was condemned before the sun had cleared the barracks roof. A soldier in shirt sleeves walked down the line with a lump of white chalk in his fist, and when the veterinary surgeon lifted 2 fingers, the soldier reached out and drew a single stroke on the animal's left shoulder, and that stroke turned a $110 cavalry remount into an $18 reject. He did it the way a man stamps a crate. He did it 11 more times in 4 minutes. And behind the rail, a heavy-set contractor in a black frock coat watched the chalk move down the line and did not smile, because he was too careful a man to smile in front of officers. But he took his watch out of his vest and looked at it, and the gesture said everything a smile would have said. The woman standing in the middle of that inspection ring was 31 years old. Her name was Ruth Teague. She had a faded blue prairie dress with the sleeves rolled past the elbow, a cream apron gone the color of weak coffee, dark hair pinned up in a braid that had lost half its pins somewhere on the 90 miles behind her, and she had not slept in 2 nights. She had brought 40 horses to Fort Meacham, Wyoming Territory, on the 14th day of October in the year 1884, under a signed contract with the Quartermaster's Department of the United States Army, and she was watching a stranger with a piece of chalk take her ranch apart, 1 shoulder at a time. 31 head. That was the final count when the chalk stopped moving. 31 out of 40, condemned in a single morning, not for lameness, not for age, not for any fault a horseman could put a hand on, but for 4 words written into a certificate by a veterinary surgeon who had been in the territory 11 weeks. Hereditary unsoundness of conformation. The regulations were plain about what came next. Condemned animals could not simply be led home. They had been presented to the government, inspected, and rejected stock at a military post went to public auction, and public auction meant a scatter of nobody in particular on a Saturday morning, and the going price for a rejected horse in that country in that year was $18. Ruth Teague had borrowed against every acre and every head she owned to fill that contract. At $110 a horse she was solvent, and her father's ranch went on. At $18 a horse she was finished, and the man in the black frock coat would buy her horses off the auction block, feed them 90 days, and present them at the next board under his own name and his own brand. That was the arithmetic. That was what the chalk meant. What nobody in that ring understood yet, not the officers, not the contractor, not the veterinary surgeon with his certificate, and not Ruth Teague herself, was that the answer to all of it was standing 8 feet away, with her head down and her ribs showing under a coat of dried creek mud, 16 years old, worth nothing to anybody, breathing slow. To understand how a horse that sold for $11 in 1872 came to be the most dangerous animal in Wyoming Territory, the story has to go back a long way before that October morning. It goes back to a corral behind the same fort 12 years earlier, and a corporal with a ledger, and a line of used-up government horses waiting to be sold off cheap to whoever came with cash in his hand. But start with the woman, because everything that came after ran through her hands. Ruth Teague was born in a sod house on the Sage Creek bottom in 1853. The year her father drove his first band of horses up from Missouri and decided he was done moving. Amos Teague was a small, dry, patient man who had failed at 3 other trades before he found the one he was good at, and what he was good at was horses. Not fast horses, not pretty horses. He had no interest in the kind of animal a man buys in order to be seen on it. What Amos Teague built, over 30 years on a creek that ran 9 months of the year and went to gravel in August, was a line of using horses. 15 hands and a half, 950 to 1,100 pounds. Short cannons, flat bone, deep heart girth, a foot that would hold a shoe on rock, and a head that did not come apart when something went wrong underneath it. He bred for the country he lived in, and the country he lived in did not care what a horse's grandfather had been called. He put a brand on them that was a diamond with a dot in the center. The diamond dot. In the county recorder's book at Rawhide Buttes, it was entered in 1869 in a hand that leaned hard to the right, and for the whole of Ruth's childhood, that mark went out into the world on the left hip of horses that came back with reputations. Freighters bought them. Stage lines bought them. A surveying party out of Cheyenne bought 9 head and wrote a letter 2 years later saying they still had 8 and would take more. When Amos Teague died in January of 1883 of a lung sickness that took him in 11 days, the diamond dot ran 206 head on Sage Creek, and every one of them, every single one, went back to a dun mare he had bought at a government auction for $11. Her name was Dove. She was a smoky dun the color of wood ash, with a darker line down her spine and faint bars across her forearms, 14 hands 3½ inches, and there was nothing about her that would make a man turn his head at a horse sale. She had come off the Army auction block at Fort Meacham in the fall of 1872 as an aged mare with a wrung wither and an old scar on the near hind from a picket rope, sold as unserviceable, along with 40 other worn-out troop horses, and Amos Teague had bought her because he liked the way she stood. That was all. He said it his whole life, and people laughed at him for it. He said he watched 41 horses in that pen for 2 hours, and 40 of them fidgeted and one of them stood, and he bought the one that stood, and it cost him $11 and it made him everything he ever had. Dove threw 14 foals in 12 years. Her sons and daughters and grandchildren were the diamond dot. Her get were the reason a hard-nosed freight outfit in Cheyenne would take a Teague horse sight unseen. And by the fall of 1884, she was 16 years old, long past breeding, kept in the home pasture with a gentle old gelding for company, and she went along on the drive to Fort Meacham for one reason only, which was that a loose band of 40 young horses will follow an old mare anywhere on earth and will not follow anything else. Ruth had grown up under that mare's belly. She had learned to ride on her. She had learned, before she learned to read, how to run a hand down a leg from stifle to fetlock and feel heat that had not yet become swelling, how to tell a splint from a curb, how to hold a hoof between her knees and pare a sole without cutting into live horn. She could shoe. She could float a tooth. She could pull a foal in the dark in the mud in April, with her arms into the shoulder, and her father holding a lantern that would not stay lit, and she had done all 3 of those things by the time she was 17. At 22, she married a good-natured young man named Tom Vance, who carried mail on the Lusk Road, and at 26 she buried him, because he tried to cross the Niobrara in April, when it was still carrying ice, which was the only foolish thing anybody could ever remember him doing. She came back to her father's place, and to her own name. In the country around Sage Creek she was Ruth Teague again, and there were women who thought that a hard thing, and a few who thought it a proud one, and Ruth never once explained it to anybody. When her father died she was 30 years old, and she had a 15-year-old brother named Wick, and 206 horses, and a note at the Rawhide Buttes Bank for $2,200 that Amos had taken out in a wet year to buy the Sage Creek hay meadow, and 11 months to pay it. There was one man left on the place, and he was 63 years old, and his name was Ottmar Ferber. He had come out of Prussia at 19, enlisted in the 2nd Cavalry because it was the only outfit that would take a man with 40 words of English, and spent 11 years as a farrier before he took his discharge at Fort Laramie in 1876, and went to work for Amos Teague for $30 a month and a room off the shoeing shed. Everybody called him Otto. He had hands like a pair of ox yokes, and a way of standing at a horse's shoulder without looking at it that made colts come to him. He had shod for the Army in 3 departments, and he had watched more government horses go under more inspecting officers than any other man in that part of the territory, and that fact was going to matter a great deal more than anyone in this story could have guessed. In February of 1884, the Quartermaster's Department advertised. It ran in the Cheyenne papers, and it was posted at the post office at Rawhide Buttes on a Tuesday, a single column of small type under the heading Proposals for Cavalry Horses. Sealed proposals in triplicate would be received at the office of the Chief Quartermaster, Department of the Platte, until 12 o'clock noon on the 15th day of April, 1884, for furnishing 120 cavalry horses to be delivered at Fort Meacham, Wyoming Territory, on or before the 15th of October. The specifications ran 9 lines, sound in all particulars, well broken to saddle, gentle under the hand, from 4 to 8 years old, not less than 15 hands 1 inch, nor more than 16 hands. Weight not less than 950 pounds, free from blemish. Bay, brown, black, sorrel or gray preferred. Each animal subject to inspection by a board of officers appointed for that purpose, whose decision shall be final. Ruth Teague read that notice standing in the post office at Rawhide Buttes with her hat in her hand and the wind banging the door behind her, and she read it 4 times. And then she asked Ida Crowell for a sheet of paper and the loan of a pen. She was $1,200 behind on her note. She had on Sage Creek more 4 to 8-year-old geldings broke to saddle than any outfit within 100 miles, because that was all Almost Teague had ever made. And she had 60 days. The bid she wrote out that afternoon. Sitting at the counter of the post office while the wind came under the door and moved the paper was for 40 head at $110 each, delivered at Fort Meacham, subject to inspection. $4,400. It would clear the note, buy hay, put a roof on the shoeing shed, and keep the diamond dot on Sage Creek. She signed it R. Teague, because Ida Crowell told her to, and because she was not a fool. Then she made a copy, and a second copy, because the notice said triplicate, and she put all 3 in an envelope and paid the postage and watched Ida Crowell drop it in the sack, and she rode home in the dark, thinking about a thing her father had said in the last week of his life, when he could not get enough air to talk above a whisper, and talked anyway. He said, "A horse does not lie about what it is, only paper lies." She thought about that a great deal in the 8 months that followed. She was going to think about it for the rest of her life. The man who was going to try to break her lived 40 miles east, on a piece of the rawhide bottom so green in June that strangers slowed their horses to look at it. Everett Bray was 52 years old that year. He had come into the territory in 1870 with a wagon, a wife who did not last 2 winters, and a talent that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with paper. He understood, earlier than most men on that frontier, that the largest single buyer of livestock in the American West was not a cattle company and was not a stage line. It was the government. The Army bought horses and mules every year, by contract, by advertisement, by sealed proposal, and it paid in warrants that a bank would take at face. And it paid on time. And it never haggled once the contract was signed. A man who learned the forms could make a living. A man who learned the officers could make a fortune. Bray learned both. By 1884, the Bray Land and Horse Company held 11 consecutive years of remount contracts in that district. He ran the Anchor B on the Rawhide, 4,000 deeded acres, and as much again that was not deeded and never would be, with a white house, a bunkhouse for 19 men, a covered breaking pen, and a barn with a shingled roof, which in that country was a form of boasting. He sat on the board of the bank at Rawhide Buttes, the same bank that held Amos Teague's note. He had a foreman named Cull Prather, who had once been a stock detective and had kept the habits. And out behind the White House, in a box stall with a half door and a window that faced away from the road, Everett Bray kept a bay stallion. The horse was called Ivanhoe. Every farmer and small rancher within 70 miles knew that name, because it was painted on a board at the Anchor B gate, and it was in the Clarion every spring in a 2-column advertisement with a woodcut of a horse that did not look much like him. Imported English thoroughbred. Landed at New Orleans, 1871. Will stand the season at the Anchor B, service fee $40, money due when the mare is known to be in foal. And below that, the sentence that made the money: sons and daughters of Ivanhoe bring the highest prices offered by the United States Army. That last line was true. And it was true because Everett Bray was the man selling them. He had built a closed circle, and it was a beautiful piece of work. He sold the service of the stallion to 200 small outfits a year at $40. Those outfits raised the colts. Bray then bought the colts back at 4 years old for $60 or $70 a head because he was the only reliable buyer in the district. And he presented them to the Army at 140 as half-blood Ivanhoe stock of certified breeding. The government paid the premium because the certificate said thoroughbred blood, and no officer in the Department of the Platte had ever had reason to open the question of where a certificate came from. Every dollar in that circle passed through one bay horse in a box stall, and the box stall had a window that faced away from the road, and no visitor had ever been permitted to walk around him. People assumed that was pride. It was not pride. In March, 3 weeks after Ruth Teague mailed her bid, Everett Bray came to Sage Creek. He came in a buggy with a hired man driving, in a black frock coat and a flat-brimmed hat. And he sat in the Teague kitchen and drank coffee out of a tin cup and admired the stove and asked after Wick's schooling. Ruth had known him her whole life the way everybody knew him, which was at a distance and by reputation, and she waited. He was pleasant about it. He said he had heard, the way a man hears things, that she had put in a proposal for the Meacham delivery. He said it was a hard business for anybody, and harder still for a woman, not because a woman could not raise a horse, he said. He had never said that and would never say it, but because a contract with the government was not a horse business at all. It was a paper business. He said the specifications would be read strictly. He said an inspecting officer could reject an animal for a walleye, a parrot mouth, a splint the size of a hazelnut, a scar in the girth place, a wolf tooth, a curb, a coarse head, a low back, an ewe neck, or nothing at all, and there was no appeal, because the advertisement said the decision of the board was final, and it meant it. Then he made his offer. He would take her 40 head off her hands at $80, cash, at her corral, in April. No drive, no risk, no inspection. $3,200, which was more than enough to clear the note at his bank, and he would present the horses himself under his own contract. Ruth Teague turned it over. $80 was not an insult. $80 was a good price for green 4-year-olds in a country where good 4-year-olds went at 45. She sat with her hands flat on the table and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that if she sold to Bray, she cleared the note and had $600 left and no contract, no reputation, no name on any government paper anywhere. And in 3 years she would be selling him horses at $60 because he would be the only man buying. She said no. He took it well. He set the cup down and said he expected she would think it over, and he went out to the buggy, and then he stopped in the yard. The home band was in the near pasture. 20 or so mares and old horses grazing along the creek willows in the flat March light. And out at the edge of them, standing with her tail to the wind, an ash-colored dun mare with a dark line down her back. Bray stood in the yard for a long moment looking at her. Then he said, in a different voice than he had used in the kitchen, "Whose mare is that?" Ruth said it was her father's old mare, the foundation of the whole outfit, 16 years old and done with foals. Bray said, "Where did Amos get her?" Ruth said, "Off the government sale at Meacham, 12 years ago, $11. And Everett Bray stood in that yard in his black coat, a man worth $100,000 in a country where a top hand made $30 a month, and he looked at a used-up dun mare for 11 full seconds without speaking. Ruth Teague remembered the number of seconds afterward, because Wick had come out on the porch and started counting under his breath the way a boy will when something is strange, and got to 11 before Bray moved. Then Bray said, easily, that he would give her $40 for the old mare, on the grounds that a man liked to own a piece of a good line. And Ruth laughed and said she would not take $400, and Bray laughed too and got in the buggy and went away down the Sage Creek Road. She did not think about it again for 7 months. Later she would think about very little else. The award came in May. It came in a printed letter with a serial number and a paragraph of conditions, and it said that the proposal of R. Teague of Rawhide Buttes, Wyoming Territory, for 40 cavalry horses at $110 per head, delivered at Fort Meacham not later than 15 October 1884, subject to inspection and acceptance by a board of officers, had been accepted, and that the proposal of the Brayland and Horse Company for 80 head at $128 had likewise been accepted, that being the balance of the requirement. Ruth read it in the post office with Ida Crowell watching her face. Then she read it again out loud, and Ida Crowell put both hands flat on the counter and said, "Well," and then said it again. The Clarion at Rawhide Buttes ran 3 lines about it on the 4th page, under the market prices, and got her name wrong, and printed it as R. League. Bertie Lowell, who edited that paper and set most of the type himself, apologized in the next issue in 6 words, and did not print a correction, and 11 months later he would print 4 columns about Ruth Teague and set them himself standing up at 3 in the morning. But that was still a long way off. What the town did with the news was about what anybody would expect. At the Buttes there was a livery, a store, a bank, 2 saloons, a wagon shop, and 140 people, and for 2 weeks the contract was the only subject anybody had. Some of it was kind. Old Hollenbeck at the wagon shop, who had bought Teague horses for 11 years, said it was about time the army bought a horse that could go 2 days without breaking down. Some of it was not kind. There was a good deal of laughter in the saloons about the government buying its cavalry mounts from a woman in an apron, and a joke that went around for a month about whether the troopers would be issued side saddles. And a fair number of men who said nothing at all in public went home and told their wives it was a shame, because a contract that size was the kind of thing a man could build on. And it had gone to a widow with 200 horses and no husband to run them. Ruth Teague heard every bit of it. She was 31 years old, and she had lived in that country her whole life, and she knew exactly how much of a person's reputation is made of other people's talk. What she said about it, at the time, to Otto Ferber in the shoeing shed, was 1 sentence. She said, "They can say what they want in October." Then she went out and started making 40 cavalry horses. People who have never done it think that breaking a horse is a contest that lasts an afternoon. What Ruth Teague had to do between May and October of 1884 was something else entirely, and it is worth understanding, because everything that happened at Fort Meacham turned on the difference. The Army did not want a broke horse. It wanted a specific machine. A cavalry remount had to stand still, while a stranger in a heavy coat threw 40 pounds of saddle and blanket over him from the near side, and again from the off side, because a trooper in a hurry does not care which side he is on. He had to stand while a man mounted with a carbine sling across his chest and a saber scabbard swinging. He had to lead beside another horse without pulling or lagging, because half the work a troop horse does in its life is being led by a man riding something else. He had to tie to a picket line among 30 other horses and stay there all night without pulling back or fighting. He had to let his feet be handled by a farrier who did not know him. He had to cross water, walk over a bridge, stand while a wagon passed, and not come apart at a bugle, a gunshot, a flapping tent, or a dropped tin plate. He had to do all of that for a man he had never seen before, on the third day of a march, at the end of a rope, on wet grass. Ruth Teague had grown up in a household that made exactly that animal. Because Amos Teague had sold to freighters and stage lines for 30 years, and freighters and stage lines want the same things the Army wants. But the difference between a good ranch horse and a horse that will pass a board of officers is 100 small finishings, and she had 150 days and 2 men, one of whom was 15 years old. They started with 68 head to make 40. That was Otto's rule, and it had been Amos's before him. Cut deep, cut early, and never bring a horse to a buyer that you are hoping about. And never ever deliver a contract without spares, because between a ranch gate and a government corral there is weather, wire, water, and other men. They ran the 4 to 8-year-old geldings into the big corral at the head of the meadow in the last week of May, and worked them through a chute one at a time, and Otto Ferber went over every horse the way a man reads a page. Mouth first, for the age, because a board of officers reads the teeth and does not take a seller's word. Then the feet, picked up in order, near fore, off fore, near hind, off hind, looking for a contracted heel, a thin sole, a crack, an old founder ring. Then hands down the legs, over the splint bones, into the hollow of the hock, feeling for the small hard swelling that says curb, and the hot thickening that says trouble in a month. Then eyes, in the shade of the shed, one at a time, with a hat brim to cut the glare. Then the back, the withers, the girth place, for old saddle scars, because free from blemish means free from blemish. 22 head came out of that count and went back to the range as too old, too small, too plain, or carrying a defect a board would find. 2 of them were horses Ruth liked personally and had ridden for years. Otto put a hand on the second one's neck and said in his heavy, careful English that it was a good horse and it was not a government horse, and Ruth agreed with him and turned it out and did not argue. And that decision, made in May in a dusty corral with nobody watching, was going to matter in October more than anything else she did all summer. The 46th that stayed got the finishing. Wick Teague was 15 and had his father's hands and none of his patience, and that summer he learned patience the way everybody learns it, which is by having it beaten into him by animals. He rode 9 of those geldings every week from June to September. He learned to swing a saddle up left-handed. He learned to mount from the offside until it stopped being strange. He learned to pony 2 horses at once, at a long trot, one on each side, and to keep the ropes clear of his own horse's tail, and he got dumped in the creek doing it and came up cursing, in a way that made Otto laugh for the only time anybody could remember that year. They sacked out every horse until a slicker meant nothing. They dragged a cowhide behind a saddle horse through the band twice a week. They tied them to a picket line, 30 at a stretch, on a line of hemp rope between 2 cottonwoods, with a picket pin and a sideline, and left them there through the night, 4 nights in June and 8 in July. Because a horse that has never spent a night on a line will fight it in front of the board, and one horse fighting a line will teach the officers everything they want to know about where the animal came from. Otto shod every one of them all around, and then pulled the shoes in September and shod them again, so that each horse would come to the board with feet that had been dressed twice by the same hand, and would stand quiet with a stranger holding a foot up. Ruth herself rode every horse in that string at least 11 times. She kept a book. It was a ledger with a marbled cover that had been her father's tally book, and in it she wrote every horse by a number and a name, the color, the markings, the height taken at the withers with a standard, the weight guessed off a girth string, the date of every shoeing, every worming with a drench, every day off, every time a horse showed a soreness and what came of it. That ledger was going to save her life. She did not know that in June it was just a habit her father had drilled into her, and the habit went like this: write the horse down the day you touch it, because your memory is a liar, and paper is not. The trouble started in July, and it did not look like trouble. The first thing was hay. Ruth had contracted in April with a feed dealer in Cheyenne for 16 tons of oat hay and 40 sacks of oats, to be delivered by rail to Lusk and hauled from there. Because the plan was to bring the 40 head onto grain in the last 6 weeks, so they would go to the board hard and shining instead of soft off grass. In the 3rd week of July, she got a letter from the dealer saying that owing to circumstances, he was unable to fill the order and was returning her deposit and wishing her every success. The letter was 2 sentences long, and the man who wrote it had done business with her father for 11 years. The second thing was the hay meadow, which was the reason for the $2,200 note in the first place. It was 160 acres of wild hay on the lower Sage that Amos had bought in a wet year and had never finished paying for, and the bank held the paper. In the first week of August, the cashier at Rawhide Buttes informed Ruth, politely, that the bank had exercised an option contained in the mortgage and had leased the standing hay for the current season to a third party, the proceeds to be applied against her indebtedness, and that she would find the arrangement to her benefit as it reduced the principal by $310. The third party was the Bray Land and Horse Company. Ruth Teague sat her horse at the edge of her own hay meadow on the 8th of August and watched 2 mowers and a rake and 6 men from the Anchor B cut 160 acres of her feed and stack it, lawfully, with the bank's blessing and haul it away east. She did not say anything to the men. There was nothing to say to the men. She rode back to the house and got the tally book and did the arithmetic on the back page. And the arithmetic said she needed 6 weeks of hard feed for 40 horses, and she now had a creek, some short buffalo grass, and $11 in the coffee tin. What she did was go and see a man named Moses Wetherell. He kept a blacksmith shop and a little horse trade on the road 2 miles below Fort Meacham, in a low building with a lean-to and a corral, and he had been there 9 years. Before that, he had been Sergeant Moses Wetherell of the 9th Cavalry, 14 years' service, discharged at Fort Robinson with a character of excellent, and in those 14 years he had ridden, fed, shod, doctored, and buried more government horses than any man Ruth was ever going to meet. He was 44 years old, built like a barrel stave, spoke slowly and only when he had decided to, and he knew the inside of the remount business the way a miner knows a shaft. Ruth had known him 6 years. He had bought 2 diamond dot geldings from her father and had told him afterward, which no other buyer ever did, exactly what was right and wrong with both of them. She told him about the hay and the oats. Wetherell listened, and then he said something that turned the summer sideways. He asked whether she had seen the amended circular. She had not. So he went into the shop and came back with a folded sheet of paper that had come to him from a corporal at the post who owed him for a set of shoes. And it was a copy of a supplementary instruction issued out of the district office and dated the 2nd of July, 1884, addressed to boards of inspection in the district, and it added, to the standing specifications for cavalry horses, 1 new paragraph. It said that inspecting officers would, in addition to the ordinary examination for soundness, satisfy themselves as to the breeding of animals offered, and would reject any animal showing evidence of hereditary unsoundness or of cold and common blood unsuited to the cavalry service, and that in doubtful cases the board might avail itself of the opinion of a competent veterinary surgeon. Ruth read it twice. She said she did not understand what it meant. Moses Wetherell said that was because it did not mean anything, and that was the point of it. He said soundness could be examined. A man could put his hands on a hawk and disagree with another man about a hawk, but the hawk was there, and both men were looking at the same hawk. Breeding was different. Breeding was a story about a horse's grandparents, and out in that country 9 horses in 10 had no story at all that anybody could prove, so whoever got to tell the story got to decide. He said the paragraph did not add a test. It added an opinion, and it put the opinion in the hands of whoever was standing next to the board when the horses came through. Ruth asked who had asked for the paragraph. Wetherall said a circular like that comes down over a district quartermaster's signature, and the district quartermaster for that post was a major named Lyle Pruitt. And Major Lyle Pruitt had lost, over 3 years, something between $2,000 and $3,000 at cards in the back room of the sutler's store. And the man who held his paper was Everett Bray. Ruth Teague stood in the doorway of a blacksmith shop in August, with a wasp working at the frame over her head, and understood, for the first time, that she was not in a horse business at all. She had 6 weeks and no feed, and what she did about it is the part of the story that people in that country repeated for 20 years afterward, usually badly. There was a bench of rough ground 3 miles up Sage Creek, broken with rock and washouts that no mowing machine could be driven across, and no man with a machine had ever wanted. It carried a heavy stand of wild hay in a wet year, and 1884 had been a wet year. Ruth Teague and Otto Ferber and Wick cut 110 acres of that bench by hand, with 3 scythes, working from 4 in the morning until the dew went off, and again from 4 in the afternoon until it was too dark to see the swath, for 19 days. They raked it with a wooden hand rake and hauled it down to the home place in a wagon with a hayrack, 11 loads, over ground that broke a wheel twice. For the oats she went to a homesteader named Sivert Nyland, who had 80 acres of oats on the flat below the buttes and no money at all, and she made a trade. She would shoe every horse and mule on the Nyland place and his brothers, and set the tires on 2 wagons in exchange for 30 sacks. She did the shoeing at night in the Nyland barn by a lantern. After riding 9 miles from her own day's work, 11 nights across 3 weeks. Sivert Nyland's wife told a woman at the store that the widow Teague came into their yard at 8 in the evening and worked until 1 in the morning and would not take supper more than once, and that story went around the boots and did more for Ruth Teague's name in that country than the contract had. And she sold 3 horses, not from the 40. She sold 2 saddle mares she had raised and used, and her father's good silver-mounted bit and headstall that had come from Missouri and was the only ornamental thing on the place, to a stage man at Lusk for $141, and she bought corn. By the middle of September, 46 head of diamond dot geldings stood in the near pasture, on hay and grain twice a day, coats coming up, hooves dressed, every one of them halter-perfect and picket-broke. And Otto Ferber went down the line with a measuring standard, and Ruth wrote the figures in the tally book. 40 for the contract, and 6 in hand. And those 6 spares cost her 6 horses worth of feed she could not spare, and were going to be the only reason there was a story to tell at all. Not one of them was under 15 hands 1½ inches. Not one was over 15.3. The lightest weighed 980 pounds, and the heaviest 1,120. 14 bays, 10 browns, 12 sorrels, 6 blacks, 4 grays. Every one 4 to 7 years old, every one sound, hard and quiet, and every one of them, on both sides of the pedigree, or on one, a descendant of an $11 mare. She had a string that a good judge would have taken at 140. That was not opinion. 2 weeks later, a captain of cavalry was going to say so out loud in front of witnesses, and it would not matter at all. The veterinary surgeon came to the district in August. His name was Pardoes Sinnott, and he arrived at Rawhide Buttes on the stage from Cheyenne with 2 trunks, a case of instruments, and a diploma in a frame from an institution in Ontario. And he took 2 rooms over the drugstore and advertised in the Clarion as veterinary surgeon and practitioner in diseases of the horse, late of Toronto and Chicago. He was 38, thin, well-dressed, well-spoken, and he had a way of listening to a stockman with his head tilted that made the stockman feel like a fool. Within a month he was doctoring at the Anchor Bee, and by the middle of September he was living there. Bertie Lowell at the Clarion, who was a nosy man in the way good newspapermen are nosy, wrote afterward that he had made inquiries in Ontario and Chicago in November and had received, in January, 2 letters. One said the institution named on the diploma had ceased to exist in 1879. The other said that no person of that name had been licensed to practice in the state of Illinois. But Bertie Lowell did not have those letters in September, and neither did anybody else. And Dr. Pardoes Sinnott rode to Fort Meacham in the first week of October in a good coat with his instrument case strapped behind his saddle, and was introduced to the officers as a professional gentleman. Ruth Teague started her horses for the fort on the 6th of October, 9 days before the delivery date, for a drive that should have taken 5. It was 92 miles by the road she took, which was not the road most people took. The direct route ran east down the Rawhide and passed within 2 miles of the Anchor Bee headquarters, and Otto Ferbers said flatly that they were not going to trail 40 government horses past that gate, and nobody argued with him. So they went north and east through the breaks and picked up the old freight trace at 20 Mile, which added 11 miles and a bad crossing, but kept them on open country the whole way. There were 4 of them on the drive: Ruth, Otto, Wick, and a hired boy named Freddie Sump, who was 17 and worth about half a man on a good day and was cheap. They took 11 saddle horses in a remuda, a wagon with a mess box in the grain, driven by Otto, and the 46 head loose in a band. And they took Dove. She was 16, and she was not going to be sold, and she had no business on a drive at all, except for the one thing an old mare does that nothing else can do. A band of young geldings that has never been off its home range will scatter at anything and drift back the way it came all night long and take a week to learn the trail. Put an old mare in front of them who has seen the world and knows where she is going and does not care about anything, and 40 horses become a string. She had a bell on a leather collar. She walked out front with her head level and her ears half back, and the whole band moved when she moved, and stopped when she stopped, and Wick rode beside her most of the way, and talked to her about nothing. 4 days went well. They made 18 miles the first day, 20 the second, 22 the third across the flats with a wind behind them, and camped the 4th night on Willow Springs, with 68 miles behind them, 24 to go, and 4 days in hand. The horses were traveling beautifully. They watered at noon and grazed at night on a picket line and a rope corral, and Otto fed a light ration of oats morning and evening to keep condition, and on the 4th evening Ruth walked down the line in the last of the light and looked at 46 horses standing quiet in a country 100 miles from anywhere, and let herself think for about a minute about the note being paid and the meadow back and a roof on the shoeing shed. The hail came on the 5th afternoon. It came off the Laramie Range the way it does in October, a green, black shelf on the northwest that swallowed the sun in 20 minutes, and it caught them in the open 6 miles short of the 20-mile crossing. There was no shelter and no time to look for any. It hailed stones the size of grapes for 11 minutes, and then the size of hen's eggs for 4. And the band broke and ran before the wind with their tails to it, which is what horses do, and is the only sensible thing they can do, and the 4 riders let them run. Because a band cannot be held in hail, and a man who tries it will ruin a horse and likely himself. When it passed, there was white ice 2 inches deep on the ground in the middle of October, and the band was scattered over 4 miles of country, and 11 head had gone through a wire fence corner that should not have been there. They spent the rest of that day and half the next gathering. 2 horses were cut on the chest and forearm, and one of those was cut badly enough that Ruth cleaned it out and stitched it with a curved needle and silk from her own sewing kit by lantern light, and that horse she cut from the contract string on the spot, because a fresh scar in the girth place is a blemish, and a blemish is a rejection, and she would not present a horse she knew would fail. That put her at 45, 5 in hand instead of 6, and they had not reached the fort. They lost the 6th day to the gather, and made camp that night on 20 Mile with the horses tired and the grain half gone. They still had 3 days in hand. It was going to be all right. At about 2 in the morning on the 7th of the drive, on a clear night with a half moon, 2 riders came down on the picket line from the north on the wind side, and one of them shook out a slicker. Otto Ferber was on watch. He was 63 years old, and he had done 11 years of picket duty on the frontier. And he was awake, and he saw them at 80 yards. And he fired a shot over their heads with an old cap-and-ball Remington, and shouted in German, which he did when he was very angry, and the 2 riders turned and went back the way they came at a dead run. It did not matter. The horses had already gone. 40 head of picketed and rope-corralled horses came off that line all at once at the sound of a slicker cracking on the wind at 2 in the morning, and it is a thing that has to be seen to be understood, because it is not like cattle. Horses do not mill. They go all together in one direction at speed, and they do not stop for 2 miles, and they take the rope, the pins, and anything tied to them along. 2 horses went down in the picket line and got up. The rope corral was carried away entire. Ruth Teague came out of her blankets and was on a horse bareback in 11 seconds, and she did not catch that band for 4 hours. They gathered until noon and then until dark, and then they made a cold camp and gathered again from first light, and by the middle of the 2nd day they had 42 of the string. And Dove, who had not run more than half a mile, and had been found standing at the top of a rise at daylight, with her bell hanging and 4 young horses standing around her. 3 geldings were never found. 2 of them turned up in December, 30 miles north, wearing an Anchor B brand burned over the diamond dot, and by then it did not matter to anybody. That left 42 head for a contract of 40. 2 in hand where there had been 6. It left them a day and a half from Fort Meacham, with the delivery date 2 days off, on the last of the grain. With the horses drawn up fine and gaunted from 2 days of running and gathering instead of grazing, and it left Ruth Teague standing at a cold fire on the morning of the 13th of October, filthy, wrung out, with a rope burn opened across the palm of her right hand, doing arithmetic that had stopped having any slack in it at all. Otto Ferber said the thing that got them up. He said, "They can only reject what we bring. So we bring 40. They came in sight of Fort Meacham at 4 in the afternoon on the 13th of October, 42 horses strung out behind an old dun mare with a bell, and the post looked the way all those posts looked. A flagpole, a rectangle of whitewashed buildings around a bare parade ground, a line of stables, corrals below on the creek flat, a scatter of civilian shacks, and the sutler's store outside the line, cottonwoods going yellow along the water, and everything else in every direction the color of a dry hide. Ruth Teague washed her face and hands in the creek before she went up to the quartermaster's office and put on the clean apron she had carried 100 miles in a flour sack for exactly that purpose. And that detail is worth keeping because of what happened to it in the next 15 hours. Major Lyle Pruitt received her standing. He was 50, sandy, going soft in the middle, with a pleasant desk manner and eyes that went past a person's shoulder. He took her copy of the contract, checked the serial number against a book, and told her that the Board of Inspection would sit at 8 o'clock the following morning. Ruth said that her horses had been driven 92 miles and had come through hail and a stampede in the last 4 days, and that she was asking for 3 days to let them fill up and rest, the delivery date being the 15th and this being the 13th. Pruitt said the board sat tomorrow. The board was composed of officers with other duties. It had been convened by post order and would sit at 8 and would take the Bray delivery at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it would not be reconvened for the convenience of a contractor. She asked where she should put the horses. He said the corral master would assign her a pen. The corral master was a civilian named Ruel Sample, who drew $40 a month from the quartermaster's department, and, as the whole flat knew and nobody said, a second 40 from the Brayland and Horse Company. He put the Teague string in the far pen at the bottom of the corral line, the one everybody called the burn pen, because it had been scraped bare years before, and nothing had ever grown in it again. It had a plank rail, a gate wide enough for 2 horses, no shade, no hay rack, and a wooden water trough fed by a wooden flume off the irrigation ditch. The flume gate was closed and padlocked, and Ruel Sample said the ditch was down for repairs and would be running in the morning. 42 horses off a hard drive need something on the order of 400 gallons of water. Ruth Teague and Wick Teague and Freddie Sump carried it up from the creek in buckets, in the dark, on foot, up a bank of loose gravel 130 yards long, 111 trips between them, from full dark until 3 in the morning. Otto Ferber, who was 63 and whose knees would not do the bank, stood in the pen and watered horses in strings of 6 and kept them off each other. At about midnight, Moses Weatherall came down the road from his shop with a mule and a stone boat and a 50-gallon barrel on it and 4 more buckets, and made 11 trips up the ditch road where the grade was easier, and did not say a word about it before, during, or after. They finished at 3. The horses had water in them, and nothing in their bellies but the last of the grain, which was 2 pounds a head instead of 8, and they stood in a bare pen in the cold with their hips slack, and the mud of the creek bank was dried on every leg and belly in that pen to the depth of a thumbnail, and on the old dun mare it was caked up over the shoulder and along the neck where she had lain down, in the wet at the edge of the water. Ruth Teague slept for 2 hours in the wagon with her boots on. At 6 she and Otto started currying, and they got through 19 head with 2 brushes and a corn broom before the light came up and it was time, and they were still working when the officers came down the hill. The board sat at 8 o'clock on the 14th of October, 1884. In the inspection ring at the foot of the corral line, a fenced circle of packed dirt with a chute at one end and a standard for measuring set in a block at the other. It was composed of 3 officers. The president of the board was Captain Merritt Sayre, 44, of the cavalry, a lean, exact, unfriendly-looking man with 11 years of frontier service and a reputation for reading a horse better than any officer in the department. The 2 junior members were a lieutenant of infantry, who plainly did not want to be there, and a young lieutenant of cavalry named Alvin Kern, 24. 2 years out of the academy, serving as acting assistant quartermaster because somebody had to. Major Pruitt attended as the contracting officer. Everett Bray attended because his own delivery came at 1, and stood at the rail in a black frock coat and did not once, in 5 hours, come inside the ring. And with the board, by permission of the contracting officer, under the supplementary instruction of the 2nd of July, stood Dr. Pardo Sinnott, veterinary surgeon, with a leather case and a folded certificate in his breast pocket that had been written the night before. They started well. That is the part that hurt for years. The first horse in was a 7-year-old brown gelding, number 11 in Ruth's tally book, that Wick had ridden all summer. Captain Sayre went over him himself. He looked at the teeth. He set him at the standard and read 15 2.5. He ran his hands down all 4 legs, picked up all 4 feet, put a thumb into the hollow of each hock, looked at his back and his girth place, stood him square and walked around him twice, and then had him trotted out 40 yards on the hard ground and back, and stood watching him come with his head tipped. Then Captain Merritt Sayre said, to nobody in particular, in the flat voice of a man saying something he considers obvious, that is a cavalry horse. The next 5 went the same way. 6 accepted in 20 minutes, and Ruth Teague standing in the middle of the ring in a dirty apron, with her hands shaking from something that was not fear. The 7th horse was a 5-year-old bay. Sayre went over him and found nothing, and was reaching for the tally when Dr. Sinnott stepped forward and asked leave to examine, and knelt at the near hind and ran his hand over the inside of the hock and stood up and said one word. Spaven. Sayre knelt and felt the same hock. There was no spaven. There was nothing on that hock at all, and both men knew it, and Ruth Teague, who had felt that hock 400 times in 5 months, knew it. What Sinnott said next was the thing that mattered, and he said it clearly enough for the officers in the rail to hear. He said he did not say there was a spaven present. He said the animal was built in such a way as to show a hereditary predisposition to spaven, that the hock was low-set and coarse and turned in, that the bone was round and common, and that in his professional judgment the animal showed the stamp of a scrub, and that under the instruction of the 2nd of July, an animal showing evidence of hereditary unsoundness or of cold and common blood was to be rejected. Captain Sayre asked what evidence of breeding was before the board. Sinnott said that was precisely the point, and that he had made inquiry, and that the entire lot presented by this contractor descended from a single mare of no breeding whatever, an animal of unknown origin bought off an Indian trade or a scrub sale 12 years ago. And he turned and pointed, and every officer and every soldier and every man at the rail turned to look at what he was pointing at, which was a 16-year-old smoky dun mare, standing at the fence of the burn pen, with dried mud caked up her neck and her ribs, showing after 4 days of running and 1 night of buckets, with her head down and her ears loose, and 1 hind foot resting. Sinnott said, "There is the dam of the line. Gentlemen, look at her." They looked at her. Ruth Teague said, into the silence, that the mare had produced 14 foals, and the get of those foals had run stage lines and freight outfits for 11 years and had never broken down, and that if the board wanted the proof of the breeding, it was standing in the ring behind her, with 6 horses already accepted out of 6. Captain Sayre said, and he did not enjoy saying it, has the contractor any documentary evidence of the breeding of these animals? A certificate of pedigree, an entry in a recognized stud book, anything bearing a signature. She said she had her father's tally book. He asked if it recorded the sire and dam of each animal. She said it recorded the dam of every animal and the sire where the sire was known, and that 4 of the sires had been bought horses with no papers, because no man in that country had papers. Sayre said, quietly, that the board was bound by the instruction. And the chalk started. It took 90 minutes. Horse after horse came up the chute and was gone over by Sayre and found sound and clean, and then was examined by Dr. Pardo Sinnott, who found in each one, in turn, a low-set hock, a coarse cannon, a plain head, a common shoulder, a want of quality, the stamp of the scrub, hereditary unsoundness of conformation. The soldier with the chalk walked behind him, 1 stroke on the near shoulder. And the tag man came after that and wired a paper tag to the halter with a number on it, because condemned animals at a military post are inventory, and inventory has numbers. 31 head chalked, 9 accepted. Ruth Teague stood in the middle of it for the whole 90 minutes with her hands at her sides. She did not shout. There is a version of this story that got told in that country later in which she said something magnificent to the officers, and it is not true. Bertie Lowell asked her about it 2 years afterward, and she told him the truth, which was that she stood there and could not think of one single word in the English language that was worth spending, because there was nobody in that ring with the power to hear it. At the end, Captain Say read the finding. 40 animals presented under contract. 9 accepted at $110. 31 rejected, cause noted on the certificate of the veterinary surgeon attending. Rejected animals to be disposed of by public auction at this post at 10 o'clock in the morning of the 18th instant, in accordance with regulations. $990 against a note of $2,200 and 4 months of interest. At 1 o'clock the Bray delivery came through the same ring. 80 head. Ruth Teague stood at the rail and watched, because she had decided somewhere in the last hour that she was going to watch every minute of it, and she saw 2 horses go through with a curb she could see from 30 feet. And she saw a horse with a wall eye, and she saw the whole 80 pass in 2 hours and 10 minutes. And she watched Culprather hand up, with each string of 10, a sheaf of printed certificates. Bray brought the stallion to the delivery. He did it every year, and it was the smartest thing he did. Before the first string came up the chute, a hand led a bay horse in a green blanket up and down the outside of the ring, for the officers to look at, twice at a walk. The near side always to the fence, and the off side always to the crowd, and Everett Bray stood at the rail and said, loud enough to carry, that gentlemen were looking at the sire of 11 years of this department's cavalry. The horse was 22 years old, and traveled short in front, and he was the handsomest thing on that flat, and the blanket did not come off. And no man there had ever seen him from the near side in his life. She could read the top one from where she stood, because it was set in large type. Certificate of breeding. The undersigned certifies that the animals herein described are the get of the imported English thoroughbred stallion Ivanhoe, standing at the Anchor B, Rawhide Creek, Wyoming Territory. Signed E. Bray. That was the whole of the evidence. A man's own printed statement about his own horse. Afterward, at the rail, Everett Bray took off his hat to her and said he was sorry to see it, and that a board was a hard thing, and that he would be bidding on the condemned lot on Saturday, and that if she wanted to save herself the 4 days and the feed, he would give her $20 a head for the 31 right now, private, which was $2 over the auction price. And she could be home by Thursday. $620 for 31 horses that had cost her 150 days and a hay crop cut by hand. Ruth Teague said no. Then she walked down to the burn pen in the dark with a lantern and a bucket and a rag, because the tag man had wired a paper tag into the old mare's halter along with the rest, and she wanted it off her. And that is how it happened. That is the whole of how it happened. She was not investigating anything. She was a tired woman, cleaning her father's mare, because it was the only thing left in that entire post that she had the power to do. She set the lantern on the rail. She wet the rag in the bucket. And she started at the crest of the neck, working the dried creek mud out of the hair in long strokes, down the neck and onto the shoulder, and the mud came away in flakes and rolls, and under the lantern, on the near shoulder of a 16-year-old dun mare that a veterinary surgeon had called a scrub of unknown origin in front of 3 officers of the United States Army, there were letters burned into the hide. There were 2 letters on the near shoulder, 4 inches high, put on with a hot iron a long time ago, and grown over with 16 years of winter coat and creek mud. U.S. Ruth Teague stood there with a wet rag in her hand. She knew what it was. Everybody in that country knew what it was. Every horse and mule bought by the Quartermaster's Department of the United States Army was branded on the near shoulder with those two letters, and the mark meant one thing only, which was that the animal belonged to the government of the United States. She moved the lantern. She washed the neck out, up under the mane, working the mud out of a mane that had not been pulled in 3 years, and there was a second brand there, smaller, on the left side of the neck below the crest, and there were 2 letters in it as well. I see. And below that, in figures maybe 2 inches high and half-grown shut, a 6 and a 4. She stood in the burn pen at Fort Meacham at 11 o'clock at night on the 14th of October, 1884, holding a lantern up to the neck of a horse she had known her entire life, looking at a mark she had never once seen because the mare had carried a full mane and a winter coat every day of the 12 years the Teagues had owned her, and she did not know what I see meant. Moses Wetherall knew. She woke him at midnight, walking the 2 miles down the road with the lantern, and he came out in his shirt and listened to her describe it, and then went in and put his boots on without a word, and came back with a lantern of his own, and the 2 of them walked back up to the corral line, and he ducked through the rail, and put his hand on the mare's neck, and turned her a little so the light fell across the hair. He stood there a long time. Then Moses Wetherell said, "Inspected and condemned." He explained it standing in the pen at midnight, with his hand still on the mare. When the Army buys a horse, he said, it brands U.S. on the shoulder, and the horse is government property from that day. When a horse gives out, gets old, gets hurt, is no longer fit for the service, a board inspects it, exactly like the board she had stood in front of that morning, and if the board condemns it, the animal is branded again, I see. Inspected and condemned, and that brand exists for one reason, so that no man can ever afterward claim that a U.S. branded horse in civilian hands is stolen. The ick brand is the government saying in fire that it gave this animal up on purpose. And then, he said, the condemned stock is sold at public auction at the post, to the highest bidder, for cash. Ruth asked what the numbers meant. He said some posts numbered them, and some did not. When a sale ran to more than a few head, the quartermaster's clerk chalked a lot number on the animal and burned it on if the sale ran over into a second day. So the clerk could call them off in order and enter them in the book. Ruth Teague said, "What book?" And that is the moment the whole thing turned over. Moses Wetherall said that everything the Army sells is written down. Every public auction at every post produces a paper called an abstract of articles sold at public auction, and it lists every lot in order by number, with a description of the article, the name of the purchaser, and the price received, and it is signed by the officer conducting the sale and certified by the post commander, and it is made in 3 copies, one retained at the post, one forwarded to the depot quartermaster, and one to the office of the quartermaster general in Washington City. Because the money belongs to the Treasury, and the Treasury counts. He said, "Your mare is not an animal of unknown origin, Miss Teague. Your mare is the best documented horse in this territory. She has got a number and a page." They went to Lieutenant Alvin Kern at 6 the next morning. Kern was 24 years old, 2 years out of West Point, unmarried, and acting assistant quartermaster at Fort Meacham because a captain had gone on leave, and he had sat on that board the day before as its junior member and signed a finding he did not believe. He had been raised in Kentucky around horses. He had watched the first 6 animals go through and had thought, privately, that they were the best string of remounts he had ever seen offered. And then he had watched a civilian in a good coat reject 31 of them for having plain heads, and he had signed the paper because the president of the board signed it, and he was a second lieutenant. Ruth Teague told him what was on the mare's neck. Wetherall told him what it meant. And Kern, who had the keys to the record room in the quartermaster's office, because he was the man who did all the filing that no captain wanted to do, stood in the cold on the office step for about a minute and a half. Then he said the sale records were public documents. They were in the third press against the north wall, wrapped in blue paper and tied in bundles by fiscal year, and it took him 11 minutes to find the bundle for 1872. Because the post had been through 4 quartermasters and 3 filing systems since then. He carried it to the desk and untied it and turned the sheets over. And Ruth Teague stood on the other side of the desk and did not breathe much. Abstract of articles sold at public auction at Fort Meacham, Wyoming Territory, on the 24th and 25th days of September, 1872, by order of the post commander, the same being animals inspected and condemned as unserviceable. 49 lots. 2 pages. Written in a clerk's hand in iron gall ink gone brown. Kern ran his finger down the second page. Lot 64. 1 mare, done, aged about 4 years, unserviceable, rung withers and old wound near hind, sold to A. Teague, $11. Ruth Teague read her father's name in a government book from 12 years before, in a hand she had never seen, and had to put her fingers on the edge of the desk. And then Lieutenant Kern's finger, going back up the column the way a man's finger does when he is reading a list backward for the fun of it, stopped 3 lines above. Lot 61. 1 stallion, bay, aged about 6 years, unserviceable chronic strain of flexor tendon near 4. Sold to E. Bray, $23. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Moses Wetherill, who had been standing at the window with his hat in his hands, said the name out loud. Ivanhoe. There was more in the bundle, and Kern found it in the next 10 minutes because a quartermaster's file is a chain, and every link is fastened to the next one. Behind the abstract was the proceedings of the inspection that had condemned those 49 animals, and behind that was the descriptive list of the animals condemned, and a descriptive list of a government horse gives the color, the marks, the age, the brand, and the date and place of purchase. Because the Army has to know what it bought and when. Lot 61, the bay stallion, had been purchased by the United States on the 11th of May, 1868, at St. Louis, Missouri, from a contractor as a cavalry horse at $128, described as bay, star, near hind white, and further described in the inspection proceedings of 1872 as having broken down in the near fore in the 2nd year of service, and having been kept at the post since as a herd animal. He had never been on a ship. He had never seen England. He had never been imported at New Orleans in 1871, because in 1871 he was a broken-down troop horse standing in a corral at Fort Meacham, eating government hay with a chalk number on his hip. He was not a thoroughbred. He was a bay gelding's worth of horse that had been bought as a common remount in Missouri, worn out in 2 years, condemned for a bad tendon, and sold for $23 to a man with a wagon and a good eye for what people want to believe. And for 11 years Everett Bray had stood him at $40 a mare to 200 outfits a season, and had bought back the colts at $60. And had sold them to the United States Army at $140 as the get of an imported English thoroughbred, certified over his own signature. Ruth Teague stood in that little office, with her hands flat on a government desk, and the whole shape of the last 8 months came up out of the floor at her at once. The feed dealer's letter. The hay meadow leased out from under her by a bank he sat on. The paragraph added to the specifications on the 2nd of July over the signature of a major who owed him money. A veterinary surgeon out of nowhere with a diploma from a school that no longer existed. The 2 riders and the slicker at 2 a.m. at 20 Mile. The padlocked flume. The burn pen. 31 horses chalked in 90 minutes on the word of one man. It had never been about 80 head against 40. It had never been about a $4,000 contract to a man who cleared $30,000 a year. Everett Bray had gone to war against her because a woman with a government contract was going to stand in an inspection ring at Fort Meacham with a string of horses. And sooner or later, somebody was going to ask her, as Captain Sayre had asked her, where her breeding came from. And the only answer she had, the only proof of origin in the world for the diamond dot line, was a government sale record from 1872, which had Everett Bray's name on it. 3 lines up. He had spent 12 years knowing that page existed, and knowing that nobody had any reason on earth to open it. And in May of 1884, a widow on Sage Creek had been awarded a contract that gave the United States Army a reason. Then Ruth Teague thought of the tag. She had pulled it off the mare's halter at 11 o'clock the night before and put it in her apron pocket, and she took it out and laid it on the desk. It was a paper tag on a twist of wire with a number written on it in pencil. And Lieutenant Kern looked at it and then went to the other press and came back with the inventory that the corral master had turned in for the condemned lot on the previous afternoon. 32 animals, 31 condemned geldings, and 1 dun mare aged, entered by the corral master, Ruel Sample, in his own hand as part of the lot presented and rejected, to be sold at public auction at 10 o'clock on the 18th of October. Ruth Teague had never presented that mare to anybody. The mare was not 4 to 8 years old, was not broke for the cavalry, was not offered under any contract, and had walked into that post in front of the band with a bell on her neck. She had been put on the sale list by a man who drew a second wage from the Anchor B. Moses Wetherell said it, because Ruth could not yet. He said Saturday morning that mare goes on the block for $8 or $9, and Culprather buys her for the Anchor B, and by Sunday night she is 100 miles from here, or she is in a hole, and there is not one thing anybody can do about it afterward, because it will all have been legal. Kern said, in the voice of a very young officer who has just understood the size of what is in front of him, that they would take it to Captain Sayre. Ruth Teague said no, and she was right, and the reason she was right is the whole reason the next 3 days went the way they did. She said, "We have got 1 page of a book. He has got 11 years, a bank, a major, a surgeon, and 80 horses that this post accepted yesterday afternoon. If we walk up that hill this morning with 1 page, they will send for the contractor, and the contractor will come, and by noon the page will be gone." She was speaking of a possibility. It had already happened. The post copy of that abstract was the one they had been reading, and it survived because Alvin Kern locked the whole bundle in the bottom of his own field trunk that morning instead of putting it back in the press. 3 hours later, at about 11, Ruel Sample came into the quartermaster's office on an errand about hay tallies and was left alone in the room for 6 or 7 minutes with the third press against the north wall. At the time, nobody thought anything of it at all. Everett Bray came down to the corral line at 5 o'clock that afternoon, the 15th of October, and asked to speak to her privately, and they stood at the rail of the burn pen with 60 feet of bare ground between them and anybody else. He did not begin with the mare. He began with sympathy. He said he had thought about it all day, and that the board had been hard on her, harder than he would have liked to see, and that 150 days of a woman's work ought to count for something even in the Army. He said he would take the 31 at $25 a head instead of 20, private, before the sale, and pay in bank paper that afternoon. Ruth Teague said no. Then Everett Bray said he would give her $500 for the old dun mare. The rail was rough cottonwood, and she had her hands on it, and she remembered afterward the exact grain of the wood under her thumb, because that was the moment she stopped being afraid of him. She said the mare was 16 and could not carry a foal and would not carry a rider more than an hour, and asked what a man wanted with her at $500. Bray said sentiment. He said he had known Amos Teague, and that the mare had made a line of horses, and that a man in his position liked to own a piece of something with a history to it. Ruth Teague said no. And Everett Bray, who had been courteous in her father's kitchen in March, and courteous at the rail that morning, and courteous his whole public life, took a step closer to the fence and said, in a voice that had nothing left in it but arithmetic, that he would give her $1,000, and he would take up her note at the bank entire. Both of them, tonight, in front of witnesses. And she could go home to Sage Creek out of debt for the first time in 4 years with her 9 accepted horses and her brother, and never think about any of it again. $3,200, all told, for one used-up mare. Ruth Teague looked at a man offering her $3,200 for an animal that his own veterinary surgeon had described to 3 officers of the United States Army 9 hours earlier as a scrub of no breeding whatever. She said no. She said one more thing, and it was a mistake, and she knew it was a mistake before it finished coming out of her mouth. She said, "I know what she is." Everett Bray stood there a moment. Then he put his hat back on and said that he was sorry to hear it and that she should be at the sale on Saturday, and he walked up the hill to the officers' line, and he was in Major Lyle Pruitt's quarters for 35 minutes. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the 16th of October, the mare was taken. It was done in the correct and lawful way, and that was the worst of it. A sergeant of the guard and 2 privates came down to the burn pen with an order signed by the post commander, Colonel Bertram Ives, directing that one dun mare, aged, bearing on the near shoulder the brand U.S., be taken up and held in the post stray pen, pending determination of the government's title. Upon the representation of the acting post quartermaster that a United States branded animal was in the possession of a civilian without evidence of lawful sale. Ruth Teague said the animal had been condemned and sold at this post in 1872, and there was an ick brand on the neck to prove it. The sergeant, who was decent about the whole thing and hated it, said the order was the order, and the thing that made it hold was Dr. Pardo's Sinnot. He had gone down at first light with Ruel's sample and examined the neck, and he had written a second certificate, and it said that the marks upon the neck of the animal were old and indistinct, that they might be an inspection brand, or might equally be a fire brand, a Mexican brand, or the scar of an injury, and that in his professional opinion they could not be read with certainty. Anybody with 2 eyes could read them. Ruth had read them in lantern light with a wet rag. But there was now a signed professional opinion on file that said otherwise, and a signed professional opinion is a piece of paper, and a piece of paper is what a post runs on. They led Dove up the hill on a halter shank between 2 soldiers. She went the way she had always gone anywhere, level-headed, ears loose, 1 foot in front of the other, 16 years old. And Wick Teague stood in the gate of the burn pen with his hat in his hands and cried, and was 15, and never once in the rest of his long life let anybody tell that part of the story in front of him. The stray pen was a small square pen of upright cedar pickets beside the guardhouse, 10 paces by 12, with a plank gate and no water in it, and they put her in it alone. At 9 that morning, Lieutenant Alvin Kern went to the 3rd press against the north wall to get the bound Register of Public Sales for the post, which was the permanent volume in which every auction from 1868 forward was entered in a clerk's hand and certified with the post commander's signature at the foot of every page. The leaf covering the 24th and 25th of September, 1872, had been cut out of the binding with a sharp knife. It had been done carefully, close to the stitching, and whoever did it had turned the following leaf back down flat so that the book would lie shut without gaping. Kern found it because he was looking for it, and because his thumb caught in the gutter where the stub was. He stood in that office with the book open, and understood, in the way a young man understands things all at once, that he was no longer looking at a hard contract dispute, There was a mutilated federal record on the desk in front of him, and there were exactly 3 people in the territory with a reason to mutilate it, and one of them had been standing alone in that room for 7 minutes the day before. Ruth Teague, when he told her, did not say anything for a while. Then she said the sentence that Alvin Kern repeated to his own children 40 years later. She said, "Good. Now the book agrees with us." Because a page that is simply missing proves nothing, but a page cut out of a bound government register with the stub still in the binding on the morning after a woman started asking about that exact sale is not an absence. It is a confession with a knife mark on it. They had 2 days and a half. The sale was at 10 o'clock on Saturday the 18th. Sitting on the tailgate of the wagon at 9 o'clock on Thursday night, with a lantern hung on the bow and the wind coming up cold off the flat, Ruth Teague and Otto Ferber and Moses Wetherall and Alvin Kern, who was risking a commission he had worked 6 years for by being there at all, worked out what they had and what they needed. What they had was one loose abstract in the bottom of a lieutenant's field trunk, unsigned copy, and a cut leaf in a bound register. What they needed was 3 things. The first was corroboration from outside that post. If the only proof of the 1872 sale was a paper in the hands of the people making the claim, then Bray would say and Pruitt would echo that the paper was forged by the woman and the young officer. But the abstract had been made in 3 copies. One had gone to the depot quartermaster at Cheyenne, and one to the office of the quartermaster general in Washington City. Washington was 4 weeks away by mail. Cheyenne was on the wire. The second was a living witness. A paper says what was written down. A man says what was done. Wetherall said there had been a corporal clerking that sale who had stayed in the country when he took his discharge, and that his name was Harmon Doak, and he kept a road ranch on the Rawhide Springs Road 40 miles south, and he had been at Meacham 11 years, and had never in his life thrown away a piece of paper. The third was the hardest, and Ruth Teague was the one who said it out loud, and when she said it Moses Wetherall started to laugh and then stopped, because he saw that she was not joking. She said, "None of it matters unless somebody makes them look at the stallion." Because that was the shape of the trap she was in, and she had seen it clearly by Thursday night. Everything they had was paper, and paper could be argued with. A cut page could be blamed on mice or a clerk. An abstract in a trunk could be called a forgery. A retired sergeant's memorandum could be called an old man's memory. And on the other side there were printed certificates of breeding, a diploma in a frame, a major's signature, and 11 years of contracts that the Department of the Platte had every reason not to want re-examined. But there was one thing in the world that could not be argued with, and it was standing in a box stall behind a white house on the Rawhide with a window that faced away from the road, and it was a bay stallion with a chronic old strain in the near fore, 22 years old that autumn, that 180 farmers a year paid $40 to breed to, that no visitor had ever been allowed to walk around. Somewhere on the near side of that horse, under a mane that had never been pulled and a blanket that was never taken off in company, there were 2 letters and 2 numbers burned into the hide by the United States government in September of 1872. I.C. 6-1. Ruth Teague said, "He has kept that horse's near side away from the world for 11 years. Make them look at it." They split 3 ways before daylight on Friday the 17th. Alvin Kern stayed at the post because a lieutenant who leaves his station is a lieutenant with no station to come back to, and because he was the only one of them who could put a message on the military telegraph. At 7:30 that morning he filed, over his own name and in his own official character as acting assistant quartermaster, a request to the depot quartermaster at Cheyenne for verification of the abstract of articles sold at public auction at Fort Meacham on the 24th and 25th of September, 1872, with particular reference to lots 61 and 64. the post copy of the record having been found mutilated. He put that last clause in on purpose. He was 24, and he had worked out, sitting up half the night, that the safest thing he could possibly do was to make the fact of the cut page official in a document that went out over a wire and was received and logged somewhere else. A thing that is only in your own drawer can be taken out of your drawer. Ruth Teague went south and west to Rawhide Buttes with a mule and a note in his hat, 44 miles, and got Bertie Lowell out of bed at 11 o'clock at night. And Ruth Teague rode south to Rawhide Springs. She took a 7-year-old brown gelding named Pilot out of Dove, one of the 22 she had cut back to the range in May because he had a saddle scar in the girth place that would never have passed a board, and she left the post at 5 in the morning in the dark, and she had gone 11 miles when she came up out of Kelly Draw and saw 2 riders on the road behind her at about half a mile. She knew that country. They did not. She turned off south into the breaks below the draw and rode 4 hours through cut banks and cedar and dry washes on a horse that had been raised in exactly that kind of ground, and came out onto the Rawhide Springs Road well below them and 11 miles ahead, and rode into Harmon Doak's yard at 2 in the afternoon with the horse walking easy and her hat on the back of her neck. The road ranch was a low log house with a sod roof, a corral, a well with a sweep, and a sign nailed to the gatepost that said meals and horse feed. Harmon Doak was 68 years old, bald as a river stone, and had run that place since he took his discharge in 1874. He listened to her for 11 minutes without interrupting, standing in his own doorway with a coffee cup in his hand, and when she finished he set the cup on the sill and said one thing. He said, 2 days. That sale run 2 days. Then he went inside and got a nail keg from under the bed. Harmon Doak had been a corporal in 1872, detailed as clerk at the post quartermaster's office because he could write a fair hand, and it had been his job to call the lots at the September sale and enter them as they went. And Harmon Doak, like every enlisted clerk who ever lived long enough to get careful, had kept a memorandum book of his own. Because the day comes when an officer says the book is wrong, and the only friend a corporal has in this world is his own pencil. The keg had 9 of them in it, tied in oilcloth. The one for 1872 was a stub of a thing, 4 inches by 6, sewn at the spine, filled front to back in pencil that had gone silver. He turned the pages with a thumbnail and found the 24th of September, and turned one more page and put it in front of her on the table. 49 lots, in order, by number, with the price and the buyer's name, in a soldier's cramped hand. Lot 61, Sloan Bay, Age Tendon, E. Bray, 2300. Lot 64, Mare Dunn, Aged Rung Wither, A. Teague, 1100. And under Lot 61, in the margin in the same pencil, there was one more line, which was not in any government record anywhere in the United States, and which Harmon Doak had written down 12 years earlier because it had struck him at the time as a peculiar question for a man to ask. Buyer of 61 asked could the ick be worked over, told him no, U.S. brand and ick both, govmark, can't be altered lawfully. He SD then I will keep him covered. Ruth Teague read that line 4 times. Harmon Doak said he remembered the man. He said he remembered him because he was the only buyer at that sale in a good coat, and because he bought the stallion and then stood around the pen for an hour afterward, looking at him from the offside and never once from the near side, and because when a man asks a corporal whether a government brand can be worked over, the corporal remembers it for the rest of his life. Then the old man asked what day the sale was. Ruth said tomorrow at 10. Harmon Doak said he would need an hour to see to the stock, and would she mind riding at night, and Ruth Teague said no, she would not mind riding at night, and they left Rawhide Springs at 4 in the afternoon, an old man on a good mule with a nail keg tied on behind, and a woman on a brown gelding, and they rode 40 miles through the dark and came onto the Meacham flat at 20 minutes past 7 on Saturday morning. Bertie Lowell got there before them. He came in a spring wagon at 6 in the morning with his coat over his nightshirt and 2 bound files of newspaper on the seat beside him, 44 miles in 10 hours, and what he had in those files was the third leg of it. The Rawhide Buttes Clarion had been founded in 1871, and Lowell had bought it in 78, and had the whole run bound by year in the back of the shop, and in the issue of the 14th of September, 1872, on the second page was the legal advertisement, because the regulations required that a public sale be advertised. Will be sold at public auction at Fort Meacham, WT, on the 24th and 25th days of September next, by order of the post commander. A number of horses and mules which have been inspected and condemned as unfit for the public service. Terms, cash, and in the issue of the 19th of April, 1870, 7 months later, on the third page, boxed, with a woodcut, was an advertisement that Bertie Lowell's predecessor had set in type and been paid $4 for. Ivanhoe, the imported English thoroughbred stallion Ivanhoe, will stand the season at the Anchor B, Rawhide Creek. Landed at New Orleans, 1871. Service, $20. Money when the mare is known to be in foal. E. Bray, prop, $20 in the first year. He had raised it to 40 by 1878. So by 7:30 on the morning of Saturday, the 18th of October, 1884, 90 minutes before a public auction that was going to sell 31 horses and 1 dun mare, there were 4 separate things sitting on a plank table in a blacksmith shop 2 miles below Fort Meacham, and they had come from 4 directions, and no one of them could have been forged without forging all of them. A loose abstract, unsigned, from the post's own file in a lieutenant's trunk. A bound register in the quartermaster's office with the leaf cut out of it and the stub still in the binding. A corporal's pencil memorandum from 12 years back with a line in the margin that no forger would ever have thought to invent. And 2 bound volumes of a country newspaper, 7 months apart, in which the government advertised the sale of a broken-down troop horse, and Everett Bray advertised the same animal as an imported English thoroughbred. And at 8:40 in the morning, 20 minutes before the sale, a soldier came down the hill at a run from the telegraph office with a flimsy in his hand for Lieutenant Kern. Abstract public sale, Fort Meacham 2425, Sept 1872, on file this office. Lot 61 stallion bay-aged condemned tendon, near 4, sold E. Bray $23. Lot 64 mare dun-aged condemned, sold A. Teague $11. Certified copy forwarded by mail this date. Acknowledge, 5 sources. 1 page. Alvin Kern folded the flimsy into his breast pocket, put on his dress coat and his saber belt at 20 minutes to 9 in the morning, walked up the hill to the adjutant's office, and requested, in writing, an audience with the commanding officer of the post before the hour of the sale, upon a matter concerning the mutilation of a federal record. That request is the reason there is a story to tell. A lieutenant does not get to stop an auction. A lieutenant does not get to accuse a contractor. But a lieutenant who walks into an adjutant's office and reports in writing that a page has been cut out of the bound Register of Public Sales of that post with a knife will get a hearing from any post commander in the United States Army, because it is not a horse matter and it is not a contract matter. It is a matter of the honor of the post, and Colonel Bertram Ives had been in the Army for 31 years. Colonel Bertram Ives heard the matter in his own office at 9 o'clock in the morning, with the door open and the sale crowd already gathering on the flat below. There were 9 people in that room. The colonel behind his desk, Captain Merritt Sayers standing at the window because he had asked to be present, Major Lyle Pruitt, who had been sent for, Lieutenant Kern with the bundle, Ruth Teague in a dress that had been washed in a horse trough at 8 that morning, Harmon Doak with his hat in both hands and a nail keg at his feet, Moses Wetherall, Bertie Lowell with 2 bound files of newspaper under his arm, and Everett Bray, who had been sent for and had come in a black frock coat with Dr. Pardo Sinnott behind him. Kern reported the mutilated register first, because that was the thing that had bought the room. He laid the bound volume on the desk and opened it and turned it around, and Colonel Ives looked at the stub of a leaf cut close to the stitching with a sharp knife, in a book bearing his own signature at the foot of every page. And the temperature of that room went down about 10 degrees. Then it went in order. The loose abstract. The telegram from the depot at Cheyenne. Doak's memorandum book, and the old corporal reading his own pencil out loud in front of a colonel, including the line in the margin, twice, because Ives asked him to read it again. And Lowell's 2 newspapers, 7 months apart. Everett Bray had an answer, and it was a good one, and for about 4 minutes it was working. He said, calmly, that he had indeed bought a condemned horse at that sale in 1872, along with a good many other things, and had never made a secret of it, and that the animal in question had been a bay stallion with a bad tendon that he had used as a teaser and a pasture horse, and that had died in the winter of 1874. He said Ivanhoe was a different animal altogether, brought west in 73, and that if there was no bill of sale in his files after 12 years, that was the ordinary condition of every ranch in the territory. He said, and it was the strongest thing he said, that the entire proceeding was got up by a woman who had lost a contract and a lieutenant who had signed a finding and regretted it. Dr. Sinnott said that the marks on the neck of the dun mare could not be read with certainty, and that he stood upon his certificate. Colonel Ives looked at the ceiling, and Ruth Teague could feel it going. Then she said the sentence she had been carrying for 2 days. She said, "Colonel, the stallion is on this post. He was led up and down outside that ring on Tuesday afternoon in a blanket. If he is not the horse that was sold at this post in 1872, then his near side is clean, and it will take 4 minutes to prove it. And I will apologize to Mr. Bray in front of the whole flat and take my 31 horses to the block myself." Nobody in the room had thought of it, because nobody in that country had ever thought about the near side of Everett Bray's stallion in his life. That was the whole trick, and it had worked for 11 years, and it took a woman who had spent 5 months with her hands on 400 legs to see it. Captain Merritt Sayre turned around from the window. Bray said the animal was private property, and he declined. Colonel Ives said that the animal had been produced by the contractor before an inspecting board of this post as evidence of the breeding of 80 horses which this post had accepted and had not yet paid for, and that the government would look at it. Everett Bray said no, and that was the end of him, right there, before anything was washed or clipped, because 8 people in that room heard a man refuse to let anybody look at his own horse. They brought Ivanhoe out of the post-trader's stable at 9:20 on the morning of Saturday, the 18th of October, 1884, in front of about 140 people who had come down for a sale and were getting something else. Culprather did not lead him. Culprather had gone for his horse at some point in the previous 10 minutes and was 6 miles down the Rawhide Road, and nobody at the Anchor B ever saw him again. Moses Wetherall led the stallion. Otto Ferber walked at his shoulder with a pair of hand clippers and a bucket of water and a rag. He was a good-looking horse. That has to be said. 22 years old, dark bay, a star, deep through the chest, and short and careful in the near fore, in a way that any horseman there could see in the first 4 steps. They stood him square on the hard ground below the office, with the near side to the crowd for the first time in 11 years, and Otto Ferber took the blanket off him. Ruth Teague knelt down at his shoulder with the rag. The shoulder came first. 16 years of a heavy winter coat coming in over a brand that had been put on in 1868, grown over and gone dull and hidden under hair and dust, and she wet it and worked it with her thumb and the flat of the rag, in exactly the same motion, on exactly the same square of hide, that she had used on a dun mare in a lantern-lit pen 4 nights before. U.S. Then Otto Ferber lifted the mane on the near side of the neck and took 2 inches off it with the hand clippers and stepped back. I see 6-1. Captain Merritt Sayer walked down off the step and stood 4 feet from that horse and looked at the brand for a long time. Then he took the abstract out of Lieutenant Kern's hand and read Lot 61 out loud from the paper in front of 140 people, and then he read the certificate of breeding, the printed one, the one that had come up the chute in sheaves of 10 with 80 horses on Tuesday afternoon, signed E. Bray. He did not say anything about it. He handed both papers to the colonel and went back up on the step. The sale did not take place. Colonel Ives suspended it by verbal order at 25 minutes to 10, revoked the order holding the dun mare, and directed that the animal be returned to Ruth Teague at once, and Wick Teague ran the whole way up to the stray pen and led her down himself with a piece of rope. And there is no record of what he said to her on the way, and there does not need to be. The rest went the way those things go, which is slowly, in offices, with a great deal of paper. The payment on the Bray contract was stopped pending investigation. The certificate of Dr. Pardo's Sinnott was withdrawn from the record of the board, and Dr. Pardo's Sinnott left Fort Meacham on the Tuesday stage with 2 trunks and was not in the Territory when the letters from Ontario and Chicago reached Bertie Lowell's desk in January, which was probably a piece of good management on his part. Rule Sample was discharged from the employment of the Quartermaster's Department on the 20th of October. Major Lyle Pruitt was relieved as post-quartermaster within the month, was the subject of a board of inquiry at Omaha in the spring, and resigned his commission in August of 1885. The supplementary instruction of the 2nd of July, 1884, the paragraph about hereditary unsoundness and cold and common blood, was suspended in the district in November and rescinded in the department in February, and the 31 condemned horses were re-inspected. Colonel Ives ordered a new board, Captain Sayer presiding, 1 lieutenant of cavalry and 1 of infantry, no civilian attending in any character, and he directed that the animals be fed and watered at government expense for 4 days first, which is a thing that had never once been done at that post and was done that time because a colonel who had been 31 years in the army had watched a woman carry 400 gallons of water up a gravel bank in the dark and had heard about it afterward from his own sergeant of the guard on the 23rd of October, 1884. 31 diamond dot geldings came up the chute at Fort Meacham with 4 days of hay and grain in them and their coats brushed out, and 29 of them were accepted. 2 were not, and Ruth Teague never argued about the 2. 1 had a curb come up on the near hind that a hard 6 days had brought out of him, and 1 had come out of the stampede at 20 Mile with a shoulder that would always be a little short, and Captain Sayer rejected both, and Ruth Teague said yes, sir, and led them out of the ring herself, and those 2 horses lived out their lives on Sage Creek, and she rode one of them for 9 years. 38 head accepted at $110. $4,180 paid by warrant on the 29th of October, 1884. She paid the note at the Rawhide Buttes Bank on the 3rd of November and got the hay meadow clear, and the bank's cashier was extremely pleasant about it, and Everett Bray did not attend that meeting of the board. Bertie Lowell gave it 4 columns on the front page of the Clarion on the 8th of November and set the type himself standing up until 3 in the morning, and the piece was reprinted in Cheyenne, and then in Omaha, and then in a stock journal in Chicago, and after that it was out of anybody's hands. 200 outfits in 3 counties read that the imported English thoroughbred they had been paying $40 a season to breed to for 11 years had been bought for $23 as a condemned troop horse with a broken-down tendon in 1872. A good many of them had bred to him 5 and 6 years running. Everett Bray was indicted in the federal court at Cheyenne in March of 1885 on the charge of presenting false certificates in the matter of a contract with the United States. The case ran 19 months and ended in a fine and the forfeiture of the balance due on the 80 head, and by then it did not matter, because his name was worth nothing in any county he could reach. The Anchor B was sold at the courthouse door in the fall of 1886. He went to Oregon in 1887 and died there, and the ranch went to a stock company that never made money on it. Nobody ever proved who cut the page. There was not a man on that flat who wondered about it. Lieutenant Alvin Kern was not punished. He had expected to be. Instead, there was a letter from the office of the chief quartermaster of the Department of the Platte in February, entered in his file, which used the words zeal and integrity, and he retired a lieutenant colonel in 1914 and told that story to his children until they could recite it. The Diamond Dot furnished horses to the quartermaster's department every year but 2, from 1885 to 1899. Ruth Teague never bid on 120 head. She bid on 40 or on 60, and she delivered them with spares, and she brought the tally book to every delivery and laid it on the table in front of the board unasked. And after 1886, no inspecting officer in that district ever asked a small outfit for a certificate of breeding again, because the department had learned in the most public way available what a certificate of breeding was worth. Wick Teague broke horses on Sage Creek for 51 years. Otto Ferber shod for the outfit until 1891 and is buried on the bench above the house, up where they cut the hay by hand. Moses Wetherill kept his shop below the fort until the post was abandoned and then moved it to town and never charged Ruth Teague for a set of shoes again, and would not discuss it. And the mare stood in the home pasture at Sage Creek for 8 more years, with the mud of a creek bank on her belly in the spring, doing nothing whatever, eating grass, and she died there in the summer of 1892 at 24 years old, and every one of the 38 horses the United States Army bought that October had come out of her. Ruth Teague kept 2 things in the front of her father's tally book for the rest of her life. One was the paper tag on its twist of wire that a soldier had wired into a halter on the 14th of October, 1884. The other was a strip of the second page of an abstract of articles sold at public auction, copied out in her own hand, with 2 lines on it, 3 lines apart. Her father had told her that a horse does not lie about what it is, and that only paper lies. He had been right about the horse, he had been wrong about the paper, and she used to say so in the last years to anybody young enough to be told anything. Paper does not only lie, paper also remembers, longer and better than any man alive, and it does not care in the least who wins. It sits in a press against a north wall for 12 years, with the sale of an $11 mare and the sale of a $23 stallion, written 3 lines apart in the same clerk's hand, and it waits for somebody to be tired enough, and stubborn enough, and far enough down to go and open the book.